Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the shadows of a world that's foggy with chimney smoke, horse dung, and more than a few unanswered questions about how people got close in the Middle Ages. You're lying on a creaky wooden bed, stuffed with straw, in a stone chamber where the fireplace crackles and wind hisses through the shutters. The candlelight flickers over the uneven walls, casting shadows like old spirits stretching. And yes, there's garlic hanging from a beam. And no, it's not just for seasoning soup. This isn't the kind of history they teach in school. Because you lucky traveler are about to find out what intimacy really looked like in a world of chamber pots, celibate monks, and love potions made of herbs you probably wouldn't want near your skin, let alone anywhere else. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up, or rather return, from your modern world to find yourself trudging down a muddy path leading into a medieval town. Your shoes aren't really shoes. They're more like sacks of leather tied to your feet. And the mud is doing a great job of getting to know your ankles. Around you, the scent of wet straw and something faintly fermented clings to the air. This is England, roughly the 14th century. But don't worry, we'll be jumping around a bit tonight. The Middle Ages stretched from about 500 to 1500 CE, depending on who you ask and how pedantic they are. So there's plenty of time and awkwardness to explore. The first thing you notice isn't how people dress, it's how they stare. Personal space? Not really a thing. And eye contact. Oh, they'll give it to you, especially if you're even moderately clean. Bathing, you see, was a bit of a luxury. Not impossible, but uncommon enough that when someone smelled vaguely like herbs and not a stale root cellar, it was practically a mating call. You wander past a couple sitting under a tattered awning. He's picking lice out of her hair, and she's humming. It's oddly tender. You'll see this again and again tonight, affection in the mundane. Because in a world where life expectancy was just a few decades, people clung to warmth however they could find it. But don't get too cozy yet. We're headed to the manor house, next, where behind stone walls and drafty halls, a very different kind of intimacy unfolds, strict ceremonial and often completely detached from affection. One noblewoman once recorded her wedding night as efficient. You'll soon understand why. But back in the village, you duck under a low archway and step into the common room of a local inn. It's loud hot and smells like every meat known to man is being roasted, or at least attempted. This is where many couplings begin. Not always with candles and roses, but with ale, a lute, and a reasonably vacant corner. Historians still argue whether these inns functioned as informal brothels or just naturally drifted that way due to supply and demand. Either way, the medieval alehouse was a social hub, and yes, people met, flirted, fought, and occasionally fell in love under the influence of barely filtered beer and wild boar stew. Someone bumps into you and sloshes drink down your sleeve. They mutter an apology that sounds more like a sneeze, and you just smile. It's fine. You're blending in. Sort of. Because what comes next is the real reason you're here. Tonight, we'll peel back the coarse linen and peek behind the heavy drapes. Not in a creepy way, more like an anthropologist with a blanket and a bedtime candle. We'll explore what it meant to be in love, or at least in a legally binding relationship, during a time when marriages were arranged, sin was quantified, and privacy was practically non-existent. And through it all, we'll remind ourselves that history isn't a dusty scroll of dates and battles. It's people. Weird, wonderful, contradictory people, just like you. And speaking of contradictions, remember that the Middle Ages wasn't one big gray blur. A peasant in 11th century France lived a vastly different life than a Moorish noble in 13th century Spain. Tonight, we'll gently wander across these spaces, picking up bits of lavender-scented linen here, a goose-feather mattress there, and perhaps a few unexpected tales along the way. Now, as you lean against the inn's warm hearthstone, sipping something suspiciously thick and sweet, the wind begins to pick up outside. You close your eyes for a second, just long enough to feel it, time softening around you, the medieval world opening like a slow yawn, and in the distance, someone's playing a lute badly. It's oddly soothing. You stay still listening. The lute continues in the background, slow, clumsy strumming that somehow suits the wooden benches, low beams, and firelit room. You take another sip of whatever's in your mug. Is it mead, weak ale, fermented barley, mixed with regret? Hard to tell, but it warms your stomach all the same. Tonight, you're here to learn how people met and fell in love, or at least into bed sheets in a world before dating apps, emojis, or long-distance text flirtations. And it turns out, the medieval version of sliding into someone's DMs often started with sliding into the churchyard after Sunday Mass. Church, of course, was more than a place to pray. It was the weekly social mixer. Everyone showed up, even those who hadn't bathed since Lent. You'd dress in your finest, which often just meant the one without holes, sneak glances during the sermon, and maybe arrange to meet afterward near the market stalls. For young men and women, the post-church gossip session was half confessional, half speed dating. In the countryside, love often bloomed among the furrows. You might catch someone's eye while sowing barley or mucking out animal pens. Romantic right, you had me at manure. Still working side by side made people notice each other's work ethic, humor, and ability to swat flies effectively. Traits that mattered when life was brutally practical. In towns, apprenticeships created opportunities too. Picture a young blacksmith's apprentice sneaking glances at the baker's daughter while delivering horseshoes. Or a merchant's niece chatting with a traveling scribe about parchment prices, but really about whether he liked poetry. It was less about charm and more about shared air. You noticed who was around, and you made do. Historians still argue whether love matches were common or rare. Officially, marriages were about alliances between families, farms, and sometimes kingdoms. But beneath the contracts and dowries, stories survive of secret courtships, of songs left under windows of girls accidentally dropping apples near boys they liked. And there were festivals. Oh, the festivals. Every saint had a day, and every saint's day was an excuse for music, dancing, and heavy drinking. Picture it: fields strung with garlands, townspeople in their best homespun food sizzling on open fires. These were moments when normal rules loosened. Chaperones drank too much. Young couples wandered off for prayers. Flirting in the Middle Ages wasn't subtle, but it had its own rhythm. A man might pluck a flower and tuck it behind your ear. He might write a clumsy rhyme, comparing you to a falcon or a summer rainstorm. If he was really bold, he'd offer a carved token, a wooden spoon, maybe a lace ribbon, and ask for your favor. Women could flirt too, though more carefully. A smile held a beat too long. A dropped handkerchief. Even washing clothes at the river could turn social laughter echoing over the water, while someone's brother made teasing comments from the bank. Not quite Tinder, but not entirely unrecognizable either. And then there was the alehouse, dimly lit, smoky, full of coarse laughter and occasional brawls. The medieval pub was a microcosm of all things human loneliness, joy, boredom, and longing. Here you might catch someone's eye over a jug of something strong. You might dance to a droning pipe and trip into someone's arms, or just lean in close to hear a story and stay for more. The setting didn't matter as much as the timing. With short lifespans, people didn't always wait for the perfect moment. You felt something, and if you could, you acted on it. Even if that meant asking a village elder to pass along a message or asking your friend's cousin's brother to carry your token across town. You glance around the inn and see it happening even now. Two farmhands laughing louder than necessary. A shepherd boy offering a piece of cheese. He definitely stole a widow, adjusting her shawl just so. The subtle and the obvious swirling together, like smoke from the hearth. Outside, night thickens. The last market carts rattle home, and a dog barks once before curling up beside the inn's steps. The stars overhead blink between clouds soft and pale. Somewhere bells toll the hour. You're not sure which hour. You're not sure it matters. You shift on the bench, stretching your legs. The person across from you yawns. Not rudely, just sleepily. It's contagious. Maybe it's the fire. Maybe it's the fact that in a world without constant light, people just stopped when it got dark. Still, in the flickering firelight, you notice something left on the table beside you, a faded flower tucked into a tankard. Not yours, not anyone's really. Just there. A leftover token from someone's hopeful gesture earlier in the evening. You smile. Some things really don't change. And now that you've seen how people met through fields festivals and furtive glances, we'll step into what came next, a medieval wedding. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all doves and flower petals. More like contracts livestock and a priest who really wanted you to say your vows correctly. But you'll get there. First, another sip of that strange sweet ale. You're starting to like it. You wake to the clatter of pots and a rooster who seems to have confused 3 a.m. with dawn. A thin beam of moonlight filters through the wooden shutters, illuminating the uneven floorboards, and a pair of mice having what appears to be a romantic dinner near the hearth. You shift under the scratchy wool blanket, your muscles slightly sore from sleeping on straw. But hey, at least you're not married. Yet, because today, you're attending a medieval wedding. Now, weddings in the Middle Ages weren't exactly romantic affairs. Sure, there might be a bit of music, maybe even some dancing later. But first, oh boy, first, there was business. You see, marriage wasn't primarily about love. It was about land livestock status, and in some cases making sure the neighboring lord didn't get too close to your wheat fields. You sit on a splintery bench beside the groom's second cousin's wife's brother. You're not sure watching as the local priest tries to keep the ceremony from devolving into a livestock auction. The groom, nervous fidgety, is wearing his only decent tunic patched 3 times, but still holding on. The bride. She's quiet. Not because she's shy, though she might be, but because she wasn't exactly consulted. Historians still argue whether consent was truly required or just a nice bonus. Technically, yes, the church insisted both parties say "I do." But in practice, a father's nod, a handshake, and the transfer of a pig could seal the deal. You glance at the makeshift altar, a wooden board propped up on barrels. A loaf of bread and a cup of ale stand in for holy relics. It's not fancy, but it's what's expected. The priest, his voice hoarse from too many chilly mornings and perhaps too much wine, begins the Latin rites. You don't understand the words, but the tone is unmistakable. Sacred, stern, slightly bored. Marriages were often arranged early, especially among the nobility. Sometimes before the couple even hit puberty. These marriage contracts were signed and sealed years before the actual ceremony. Love. If it came later, like a second harvest, uncertain, but hoped for. In the peasant class, things were a little looser. Marriages still had to be public and witnessed, but the actual paperwork was more flexible. Some couples simply declared their vows in front of a crowd and called it a day. The church tried to regulate it. God knows they tried, but love had a funny way of slipping through loopholes. After the vows, the couple walks around the village green. Everyone clapping, shouting, well wishes tossing herbs or old crumbs. No rice yet. They're officially hitched, but don't expect a honeymoon suite. Instead, they're paraded to the marital bed. Yes, the bed. The whole village knows what's about to happen, and in some places, brace yourself, they might even witness it. That's right. In certain medieval traditions, especially among the nobility, the consummation of the marriage was a public concern. Not that everyone gathered to watch directly, but there might be attendants posted just outside the door, waiting for the signs of successful union. A stained sheet, a cheer, maybe even a scribe with a very uncomfortable job. Thankfully, most peasants didn't go that far. But it wasn't exactly private either. With homes often consisting of a single room, the newlyweds might share their wedding night with parents, siblings, and a goat, all within arm's reach. Romantic. And about that bed, it's a wooden frame with rope supports and a lumpy straw mattress. You lie down briefly just to feel it. It creaks like it's trying to warn you about your choices. No pillows unless you're rich, and blankets scratchy wool if you're lucky. Sometimes fur, sometimes just each other. You hear laughter outside a clumsy flute melody and someone shouting about turnips. The party has moved on, but inside, the couple lies together stiffly, at first, then relaxing a little. It's not about fireworks. It's about surviving together. Maybe thriving if they're lucky. Maybe even falling in love. There's garlic strung above the bed. For fertility, or maybe to ward off evil spirits. Possibly both. Someone left a dried rosemary sprig on the pillow. A neighbor's blessing, or a not-so-subtle hint. You drift off briefly. Outside, the moon has risen higher. The mice have finished their romantic dinner. The coals in the hearth glow red, and as you listen to the hushed giggles of the bride's younger sister from behind a curtain that hides absolutely nothing, you realize something oddly comforting. For all the formality and odd customs, at the heart of it, people were still just people. Nervous, hopeful, curious, maybe even a little excited. Tomorrow, they'll wake up married. Maybe they'll argue about goats. Maybe they'll grow old together. Maybe this was just a step in a larger game of land and legacy. But tonight, they begin a new chapter. You turn on your side, nestling into the straw, letting the muffled sound of dancing feet and distant singing soothe you. Next up, the church is going to have a lot to say about what happens under that blanket, and not all of it makes sense. Get ready for the world's least sexy sin charts. The rooster crows, again louder this time, like he's personally offended by how late you're still in bed. You groan roll over and stare up at the smoke-darkened rafters of your cozy, creaky peasant dwelling. Somewhere, someone's already churning butter. Somewhere else, a monk is scowling at a drawing of two people holding hands. Because today, dear traveler, we're talking about what the church had to say about your bedroom habits. Spoiler a lot. You trudge toward the village chapel, boots squelching through morning mud, and the bells toll with a heavy, sleepy clang. The building is small stone walls, wooden door, a single stained glass panel showing a very judgmental angel. You slip inside just in time to hear the priest launching into one of his favorite topics, sin. Now, sin in the Middle Ages wasn't just a vague concept, it came with categories. There were mortal sins, the soul-crushing ones, and venial sins, the oopsies. And oh yes, there were very specific instructions about how you were allowed to express intimacy, and how you absolutely weren't. One of the most unintentionally hilarious historical artifacts of this period is the penitential handbook. Priests used these to assign confessions and penances. Some were so detailed, they practically read like medieval bedroom manuals with a twist of fire and brimstone. For example, did you know that missionary position was basically the only one officially sanctioned? Anything else standing up side by side, or heaven forbid involving mirrors, was grounds for confession. Natural use was the phrase tossed around as though people came with an instruction manual. Historians still argue whether these guidelines were actually followed or just idealized, kind of like those gym routines we all promised to start Monday. You find a dusty copy of a 10th century penitential left open near the altar. The pages crackle as you gently turn them, squinting to make out the Latin. It lists acts and their assigned penances, some of which involve fasting, some alms, and some truly medieval, just sitting alone in silence, thinking about what you did. One particularly memorable entry goes something like, "If a man lies with his wife out of sheer lust, he shall do penance for 7 days." So basically, if you were too enthusiastic with your legally wedded spouse, you owed God a week of dry bread and prayer. It gets stranger. There were rules about when you could do the deed. Not on feast days, not during Lent, not on Sundays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, and definitely not during Advent. So that left Mondays, maybe Thursdays, if you were fast about it. You start to wonder if medieval couples had to keep a sin calendar. The church's grip wasn't just about enforcement, it was about control. In a world where so much felt chaotic war, famine, disease, the body was one thing the church tried desperately to regulate. Sexual behavior was a symbol of order, predictable, contained, godly, yet beneath all these rules, people were still well people. They slipped. They whispered. They found ways. The confessional line was never short. You sit near the chapel window, watching a bee float lazily by. A couple walks past, outside the man brushing his hand briefly against the woman's waist. It's so casual you almost miss it. But that moment, small, rebellious human feels more powerful than all the dusty scrolls inside. And not every priest was obsessed with sin charts. Some turned a blind eye, others quietly disagreed. A few even offered marriage advice that was surprisingly warm and thoughtful. It wasn't all doom and chastity belts, though. Yes, we'll get to those later. By the way, chastity belts. Probably not as common or real as people think. Most historians now believe they were either metaphorical, ceremonial, or later Renaissance inventions exaggerated by Victorian collectors. But hey, the idea of medieval anti-hanky-panky underwear does make a dramatic visual. As you step out of the church, you pass a side door leading to the rectory. A group of scribes is hunched over their desks, copying more penitentials. One sighs, scribbles something about impure thoughts on Saint's Day, and then reaches for a second candle. You decide not to ask what he's thinking about. The sun is higher now. The village is waking up in earnest. You wander past homes some with their doors open, the sounds of breakfast being made, porridge, bubbling chickens, clucking, someone shouting at a cow. Life goes on, and despite the heavy-handed moral regulation, affection still flourished. A kiss behind the barn, a joke whispered during prayers, a pressed flower left on a bench. The human heart, it turns out, doesn't always listen to sin charts. Still, the church's teachings shaped how people saw their bodies and desires. Shame, duty, control, it wove into the fabric of relationships. Not always toxic, not always repressive, but present. Like the faint ringing of the morning bells always in the background, you pause near the bakery, where the air smells like rising bread and ash. A young couple walks by, hands almost touching. You smile. Maybe they'll get caught. Maybe they'll get married. Maybe they'll just keep walking their love, a quiet defiance against 1,000 years of rules. Next up, not everyone settled into holy matrimony. Some stayed single by choice, or found excitement behind the alehouse, far from prying eyes. Time to slip into the shadows and see what secret affairs the town hides when no one's watching. The sun dips lower in the sky, now casting long shadows across cobbled lanes and mossy fences. You follow one such path behind the alehouse, a worn foot trail, soft with trampled grass and sweetened by the smell of spent mead and wildflowers. This, dear traveler, is the unofficial side of medieval life, where things happened that never made it into the church records. Because while marriage was sacred and sin charts were scribbled furiously by candlelight, not everyone followed the script. You crouch behind a stable wall, just observing, of course, as a flaxen-haired baker's assistant sneaks a quick smile to the tanner's son. No words, just a knowing glance and the softest brush of hands before disappearing around a corner. Ah yes, the old medieval meet me, where no one will see us routine. You see, single life in the Middle Ages wasn't always about chastity and prayer. In towns and villages across Europe, many people lived outside the tidy definitions of husband or wife. Some were widows, some had chosen independence, and others simply hadn't found a match yet. And they didn't always wait for the church's blessing to find warmth on a cold night. Alehouses were particularly notorious. Dimly lit, thick with smoke and fermented dreams, these taverns were more than drinking dens. They were the medieval equivalent of social clubs, date spots, and occasionally unofficial brothels. You wander in and immediately feel the air shift, less about religion, more about release. At the corner table, two traveling musicians share a bench and a smirk. One leans in, close, whispering something that makes the other spit out his ale, laughing. In the back, a brewer's wife, who's definitely not single, flirts openly with a soldier who definitely doesn't mind. Historians still argue how common premarital and extramarital relationships were, but court records show enough accusations of fornication, bastardy, and night walking to suggest people were not always as pious as the parish registers hoped. Many of these cases were brought before local courts, where punishments ranged from fines to public shaming. But were they moral crusades, or just neighborhood gossip gone formal? That's the debate. You pass a group of young women outside, plucking chickens and giggling behind cupped hands. They pause as a shepherd passes, then burst into even louder giggles. Flirtation was everywhere, even among the hay bales. And then there were the professional companions, women, and sometimes men, who offered pleasure for pay. Prostitution, though frowned upon, was often tolerated. Some towns even had designated red light districts managed under the logic that it was better to keep vice in one place than have it wander everywhere. One particularly forward-thinking German town issued regulations for local brothels, ensuring taxes were paid and workers were clean by medieval standards anyway. You duck into one such lane now, a side street in a bustling port town, where the walls lean inward like gossiping old women. A door swings open and music drifts out. The woman inside offers you a coy glance, then turns her attention back to adjusting the lace on her sleeve. She's not a victim. She's working. And yes, there were risks, disease violence, social ruin. But some workers saved money, owned property, and even wielded influence over their clients. Like all things in the Middle Ages, it was complicated. Not black and white, just very medieval. But not all secret meetings were transactional. Some were tender. In the margins of surviving love letters and court testimonies, you find glimpses of deep affection. A cloth embroidered with initials, a poem tucked into a boot, a promise made in whispers. Illicit, yes, but full of longing. One story tells of a milkmaid who met her sweetheart each week by a ruined bridge. They carved initials into the stone, exchanged trinkets, and planned to run away. No one knows if they did. The bridge is still there. You lean against a post, watching the flickering lamplight on puddled streets. Somewhere, a door creaks open, and someone slips out, pulling their cloak close. No one says a word. Affairs carried weight, of course. Jealousy could burn hotter than any hearth. Husbands returned from war to find unexpected tenants. Wives accused maids of seduction. And sometimes entire communities picked sides in these domestic dramas. The medieval version of a relationship status was complicated indeed. Punishments varied fines, forced pilgrimages shaving one's head, or most theatrically parading the guilty party through town in ridiculous costumes. One favorite, the infamous chicken mask. You walk past a town square and can just imagine it feathers shame and public laughter. Effective, maybe. Humiliating, definitely. Still, people found a way, even when the risks were high, because intimacy, for all its messiness, was human. And whether you were bound by vows or drawn by impulse, the desire for connection never quite fit within parchment rules and carved commandments. You head back toward the inn, footsteps echoing softly in the dark. A cat darts across the road, pausing only to judge you before disappearing into a doorway. You laugh quietly. Even the animals seem to know when you're up to something. Tonight, we've seen love behind curtains and laughter behind stables. But where did all this passion unfold? Not in velvet-draped four-posters. Next, we'll explore the actual mechanics of medieval bedrooms, beds, sheets, and the concept of privacy, which was often more of a suggestion than a reality. You push open the inn door. A bench by the hearth waits, and a lumpy straw mattress upstairs is calling your name. The stairs creak beneath your feet as you climb back up to your tiny inn room. You're not alone. The man in the next room is snoring, like he's trying to summon thunder. A dog scratches somewhere below. and from behind, a thin curtain. Someone giggles, in a way that suggests bedtime isn't strictly for sleeping tonight. You push open your door and take in your temporary quarters. It's simple: a low wooden bed, a single candle, and a small window stuffed with cloth to keep the draft out. But what really draws your attention is the bed itself, a sagging rectangle of rope straw and lumpy fabric, more closely related to a hammock than anything you'd call a mattress today. Welcome to the medieval bedroom. Or rather, the medieval idea of sleeping arrangements where privacy was scarce comfort was negotiable, and intimacy often happened within earshot of a full audience. Let's start with the basics. If you were rich, your bed might be a masterpiece: carved wood high posts, thick curtains to trap warmth, and more importantly, hide your business. These beds were status symbols. Some even traveled with their owners disassembled and packed like prized furniture. But if you were poor, which most people were, your bed was likely a wooden frame with ropes woven across it, topped with a mattress made of straw reeds, or if you were lucky, feathers, and the phrase, "sleep tight." It likely comes from those rope beds. They had to be tightened regularly to prevent sagging. You'd grab a tool and twist the ropes to firm things up, lest you sink into a medieval hammock pit of your own making. Now about those sheets. Linen if you had it, wool if you didn't, and often no sheets at all. People slept in their shifts long nightshirts, or sometimes nude, depending on local customs temperatures and whether or not you expected visitors. And by visitors, we mostly mean fleas, or rats, or your sister's 3 children, because families often slept communally. Historians still argue how common family bed arrangements were. In many households, everyone from grandparents to infants shared a single sleeping space. Add a dog, a few chickens for warmth, and you've got a full medieval cuddle pile. Not exactly conducive to romance, but somehow, people still managed. A couple might slip out to the barn, a quiet field, or the loft, if they could steal a moment. Some homes had a raised bed shelf separated from the main space by a curtain. If you drew it, it was a hint. If you didn't, well, no one's business, sort of. You lie down on the bed, testing the straw. It crunches under your weight and releases a faint grassy scent. Not unpleasant, but not luxurious either. Still, after a long day of work, most people fell asleep within seconds, exhausted, sore, and thankful for even this small comfort. Above your head hangs a small, dried bundle of herbs, lavender, and rosemary tied with twine. Folk believed it kept away lice and evil dreams. The room is cool, but not cold, the candle sputtering as it reaches its final inch. You pull the blanket a single itchy wool layer up to your chin and listen. Next door, the snoring intensifies. Downstairs, someone drops a ladle. A distant owl calls. And outside, wind rattles the shutters like a gentle knock. There was little concept of nighttime privacy. Homes were single-room structures for most peasants. Even wealthier families shared space with servants, children, and extended relatives. A newlywed couple might spend their first night mere feet from the bride's mother, who'd be offering unsolicited advice through the curtain. If you were lucky, you had a chamber, a separate room. But even then, walls were thin, and expectations were often communal. Privacy was a luxury of the future. In the Middle Ages, even your dreams had company. Let's talk lighting. Candles were expensive. Most people went to bed shortly after dark. If you needed to find your partner in the dark, well, you better know your way around. And if things went bump in the night, you reached for your cudgel before your slippers. One surviving account describes a man waking to find someone else in bed with his wife. When he confronted them, the intruder claimed he thought it was his wife because they lived in the same village and had similar sleeping arrangements. Whether this was a lie or just an embarrassing case of medieval mistaken identity, no one can say. As you drift further into this room's gentle gloom, your thoughts wander to the other side of the spectrum. What about the rich, the nobles, the lords, and ladies? Their bedrooms were bigger, but not necessarily better. A noble woman's bedchamber might be filled with tapestries, rugs, and a carved headboard, but she'd rarely sleep alone. Ladies-in-waiting servants' guards all might sleep on pallets in the same room. Your every move might be observed, reported, gossiped about. In some ways, the peasant barn offered more freedom. Still, the heavy bed curtains of the elite did offer a little privacy. Couples whispered behind them, conducted affairs both romantic and political, and occasionally just pretended to be asleep to avoid awkward conversations. You yawn and stretch the bed, groaning beneath you like an old man complaining about the weather. There's something oddly comforting about this space. It's not sleek or soft or silent, but it's real, worn, lived in. And as your eyes close, you think this is where so much of life happened. Births, deaths, love, loss. On beds just like this across centuries. Next, we'll venture into the stranger side of medieval courtship. Love charms, garlic-based perfumes, and why bathing was somehow both erotic and extremely rare. Bring your herbs and your nose plugs. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because the straw mattress beneath you has poked you in just the right place for the 5th time. You stretch, scratch, and itch. You probably shouldn't think too hard about, and sniff the air. Ah, yes, that would be the chamber pot in the corner. You get up, pull on your shift, and make your way down to the communal wash basin. A wooden bucket sits there with cloudy water, a sliver of something that was once soap, and a rag so stiff it could double as armor. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval hygiene and its surprising relationship to love. Let's be honest, the Middle Ages weren't famous for their fragrance. People did bathe, but not often, and not in the way we picture. Public bathhouses existed especially in towns and cities, and were often gender segregated. But they didn't stay just about bathing for long. You ease into a memory of one such bathhouse, warm, steamy wooden walls lined with benches. Buckets of hot water are poured over your shoulders. A woman scrubs your back with rosemary and salt. It's oddly relaxing until someone in the next room starts giggling. A lot. Turns out, many bathhouses offered more than a rinse. Let's just say some massage attendants worked overtime. Eventually, the church caught on and condemned the bathhouses as dens of sin. Many were shut down. Others just moved slightly further outside of town. Historians still argue whether cleanliness equaled virtue or temptation. On one hand, bathing was seen as indulgent, even suspicious. On the other, it was a social event, a chance to chat, flirt, or admire someone's ankles under the steam. For a society obsessed with sin, it sure had a lot of semi-naked public washing. But if you weren't near a bathhouse or couldn't afford one, you improvised. You might sponge off with a damp cloth or scrub your face with wine and vinegar. Teeth rubbed with salt or crushed mint. Hair combed with bone picks, occasionally washed, but more often oiled and braided to keep the lice guessing. Perfume existed, but don't think Chanel No. 5. We're talking lavender sachets, rose water, and lots of garlic. That's right. Garlic was believed to enhance virility, ward off illness, and allegedly attract the opposite sex. So if your medieval crush smells like a walking stew, just know it's intentional. Love charms were another tool in the medieval romantic arsenal. You pass a small apothecary tucked between two cottages, its shelves lined with dried herbs, feathers, crystals, and curiously bat wings. The herbalist eyes you knowingly and hands you a sachet wrapped in linen. Inside, a blend of basil for love, thyme for courage, and something unidentifiable that smells faintly of old cheese. She assures you it will make you irresistible. You're not convinced, but you tuck it into your pocket anyway, just in case. People turn to all kinds of magic to find or keep love. Some recited Latin incantations over wine. Others slipped rose petals into a crush's drink. One old folk remedy advised smearing goose fat on your lips to ensure your lover remained faithful. Effective, questionable. Entertaining, absolutely. And then there were the potions. Medieval love potions were usually herbal infusions, often involving fennel sage or cinnamon. Some had more alarming ingredients. One 14th century recipe includes dried mare's milk-ground pigeon hearts and the hair of the intended. You look at the apothecary's dusty shelves and suddenly feel grateful for the invention of chocolate. But love in the Middle Ages wasn't all mystic herbs and moonlit glances. It had to survive smells, superstitions, and occasional skin conditions. You pass a couple sitting together outside a blacksmith's hut. She's braiding his hair, and he's letting her, even though he has soot on his nose and a suspicious blister on his hand. That's love, medieval style. People made do with what they had. A clean shirt, a combed beard, and some crushed mint leaves behind the ears could be enough to impress. Or a lucky charm stitched into your hem. Or a song sung softly by the fire. Still, the idea of romantic cleanliness is a modern one. In the medieval world, shared labor, shared hardship, and the occasional rosemary foot bath were as close as it got. You sit by a stream, now rinsing your hands in the cold water. A toad blinks at you from a rock, unimpressed. Across the bank, someone scrubs laundry on a flat stone, humming a song about love, lost and bread stolen. It's oddly catchy. The morning mist begins to rise, carrying the scent of damp earth and thyme from nearby gardens. You inhale deeply and realize beneath the smoke and sweat, there's something grounding here. Something honest. Love wasn't polished or perfumed. It was raw, tangled, real, and very often poetic. Next, we'll head into the lofty courts of nobility, where love was more about poetry than passion, and knights spent years pining for ladies they weren't allowed to touch. Welcome to the strange, aching theater of courtly love. You find yourself climbing a winding stone staircase now, one slippered foot at a time. The walls are draped in tapestries, deep reds, dusky blues, images of lion saints and long-haired maidens with unreadable expressions. A servant nods you through a carved wooden doorway into a chamber filled with soft music, the scent of beeswax candles, and something else longing maybe. This is no barn or peasant loft. This is a noble court. And tonight, you're here to witness a performance, not a play exactly, but the emotional spectacle known as courtly love. The lady sits in a high-backed chair, embroidering what might be a hunting scene, or might just be a very nervous-looking deer. Her eyes barely flicker as the young knight kneels before her. He offers not a rose, but a poem. His voice quivers slightly as he reads. It's about her eyes, obviously, and the curve of her wrist, and how her beauty is the torment of his soul, etc., etc. This is courtly love in action, equal parts admiration, frustration, and outright emotional chaos. Originating in the 12th century courts of southern France, courtly love was a highly stylized tradition of romantic devotion. But here's the catch: it was never meant to be consummated. In fact, part of the appeal was that it couldn't be. Forbidden love, noble restraint, the emotional slow burn of the medieval world. You lean against the stone wall watching the knight try not to pass out from sheer sincerity. He's not even trying to seduce her. He's trying to suffer beautifully in her presence. Historians still argue whether these rituals were widespread or mostly poetic fantasy, but the literature is full of yearning glances, coded words, and symbolic tokens. Gloves, scarves, sometimes even belt buckles. The medieval version of "I left my hoodie at your place" was far more dramatic. Courtly love had rules, so many rules. A lover must be chaste, loyal, secretive, and completely devoted. The lady must remain distant, aloof, ideally married to someone else. If the love was mutual, it had to be expressed in riddles and metaphors. If not mutual, well, that was even better for poetry. You pass through the corridor into a garden courtyard, where another knight is composing his own masterpiece under a pear tree. He's been at it for an hour, and still hasn't found a rhyme for glove. A lady strolls by her dress, sweeping the ground like mist, and pretends not to notice. That's half the game, and yes, these affections were often real. Sometimes they led to affairs. Sometimes they remained tormented footnotes in someone's diary. But they shaped how medieval people thought about romance. The idea that love could be noble, spiritual, suffering, all the fun stuff. At a nearby table, a group of ladies is playing chess while dissecting a love story that involves mistaken identities, a falcon, and someone fainting from heartbreak. Just a typical Tuesday. Courtly love also gave rise to a new form of female power, idealized, of course, but still influential. The beloved lady became a figure of control. She inspired duels, dictated fashion, and could destroy a man's sense of self with a single sigh. Sure, it was all deeply patriarchal underneath, but for a moment, women could hold court, even if just symbolically. You peek into the hall again. The knight is now composing a ballad with the help of a slightly drunk lute player. It's about how his soul is like a wounded hawk. The hawk is also cold and lonely, and maybe has a limp. You lose the thread, but appreciate the effort. All of this may seem strange, overwrought, performative, but consider the context. In a world full of political marriages and religious constraints, courtly love offered an emotional outlet, a way to dream, to feel, to express desire, without, at least in theory, breaking any rules. And it seeped into everything. Song, poetry, heraldry, even dance. There were choreographed performances where each step symbolized an emotion. You imagine trying to waltz your way through a breakup. Challenging, but graceful. You walk now beneath the stars past ivy-clad walls and silent statues. A lady leans from her balcony above hair braided with silver thread. Below her, a young squire stares up, clutching a rose that he definitely didn't grow himself. She sighs dramatically. He sighs louder. The moon sighs too. It's absurd. It's lovely. It's deeply human. And though most people never lived like this, peasants were too busy surviving to moon over metaphors. The stories trickled down. Songs were sung in taverns. Poems were scrawled in the margins of cookbooks. A shepherd might carve a heart into a tree. A maid might wear a borrowed ribbon just to feel admired. Even now, as you return to your bed beneath the rafters, you can feel that longing in the air. A kind of love that burns slow, stays unspoken, and makes you feel like the main character in a tale that never quite ends. Next, we trade roses for remedies because the medieval world had creative ideas about birth control. Get ready for crocodile dung onion juice and why fertility advice should never come from a man named Brother Gilbert. You wake to the scent of herbs, sharp, earthy, and suspiciously oniony. Someone is boiling something downstairs, and if the bubbling sound is anything to go by, it's either soup or a 13th century contraceptive. Today, we step into the murky realm of medieval birth control, a topic that was somehow both forbidden and incredibly popular. Because even in a world of arranged marriages, sin charts, and public betting ceremonies, people still ask the age-old question, how do we not have a baby right now? You sit cross-legged in the corner of a kitchen where a local midwife is grinding roots with alarming enthusiasm. She's preparing a mixture of parsley vinegar and crushed willow bark. It's supposed to cool the womb medieval code for making conception less likely. No guarantees, of course. But in a time when childbirth was dangerous and resources were thin, yes, mostly women developed and shared herbal knowledge to manage fertility. Historians still argue how effective these methods were. Some, like pennyroyal tea or rue, had mild contraceptive properties, though too much could be toxic. Others, like sitting in a cold stream after intercourse or hopping backward 3 times, were more symbolic than scientific. But they spoke to a desperate hope passed hand to hand across generations. You leaf through a worn herbal tucked under a blanket near the hearth. Its pages are stained, its margins crowded with notes, some in Latin, others in crooked vernacular. One recipe suggests inserting wool, soaked in wine, and mint oil. Another calls for a plug of mashed figs and honey. You're not a doctor, but you're starting to see why modern medicine was a welcome invention. And then there's the truly legendary remedy crocodile dung. Reportedly used in ancient Egypt, the idea somehow traveled through medieval texts. You imagine a noblewoman in a candlelit chamber asking her maid for something exotic, and the poor girl returning with a smelly lump and a shrug. Most of these concoctions were made by women for women. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women carried this knowledge quietly, carefully. Because while the church didn't always ban such practices, it definitely didn't approve of separating pleasure from procreation. The idea that intimacy should be strictly for reproduction was preached loudly from the pulpit. But reality much messier. Couples found ways. They always have. You're invited now to sit by a group of women at market trading gossip and recipes under the guise of selling herbs. One slips you a sachet and tells you it's for timing. She won't say more. But the look in her eyes says plenty. Even wealthier women cloaked in layers of velvet and lace whispered to their maids about certain teas and powders. In court, in tavern and cottage, they sought control. Limited, imperfect, often dangerous, but control nonetheless. Men, for their part, had fewer options. Some tried coitus interruptus, often with mixed success. Others relied on superstition, carrying a stone from a weasel's nest or wearing certain amulets. One particularly bizarre belief claimed that if a man wore roasted hair kidney tied to his thigh, he he'd remain infertile for a week. You raise an eyebrow and make a mental note never to try that. And yet among all the quirks and myths, a more serious truth hums below the surface. For medieval women, pregnancy could be life-threatening. Birth control wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. So when the local priest preached abstinence and the noblemen insisted on his rights, many women turned to each other. Behind closed doors in candlelight, they brewed, whispered, and hoped. You wander now through a quiet forest path, herbs brushing your legs, mugwort, yarrow, fennel, plants your modern world calls weeds, but which once held power, however fragile. You imagine the hands that gathered them, the minds that remembered what each leaf might do. Eventually, the church did push back harder. Midwives were accused of witchcraft. Herbalists were feared. But the knowledge never vanished. It just went underground. Passed in secret, murmured like lullabies. You return to the village, a pouch of dried mint in your pocket, and a head full of strange, sharp smells. Someone offers you a slice of onion, claiming it prevents unwanted spirit entanglements. You smile politely and decline. Later, as the stars rise and laughter echoes from the alehouse, you sit by the fire, reflecting on what you've learned. Control desire agency. They all existed here, even in the simplest forms. A sprig of rue, a sip of bitter tea, a hand on the shoulder, and a whispered, "Not tonight." And for those nights when "not tonight" didn't work, there were midwives, brave, brilliant, and probably exhausted. Next, you're invited to witness what happens when those timing sachets don't quite do the job. The world of medieval pregnancy birth and the mysterious rites of midwifery await soothing prayers, herbal brews, and a few things no one told you about licorice root. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting a golden haze over the thatched rooftops as you make your way toward the midwife's cottage. A rooster crows lazily. Somewhere in the distance, a blacksmith strikes his first blow of the day. But here, at the edge of the village, the mood is different. Quiet, hushed, reverent. Today, you'll witness a medieval birth. You duck through the low doorway and are immediately wrapped in warmth, both literal and emotional. The hearth burns low. A pot of water simmers with herbs and the scent of lavender licorice root, and something metallic fills the air. The midwife, a wiry woman with steady hands and a voice like linen, nods for you to stay near the wall. You oblige, watching as she checks on her patient. The young woman in the straw-stuffed bed is pale sweat beading on her brow. Two other women support her, an aunt and a neighbor, you think whispering encouragement and wiping her face with a damp cloth. A small wooden crucifix hangs from the ceiling, spinning gently in the draft. Beside it, bundles of dried yarrow and sage. Welcome to a world where science and superstition share the same bedpost. Medieval childbirth was almost entirely the domain of women. Doctors were rarely involved unless you were wealthy, and even then, most preferred not to interfere with what they considered women's mysteries. Midwives were central figures, equal parts: nurse, herbalist, spiritual guide, and emotional anchor. You watch as the midwife gently places a charm under the bed, something carved from oak tied with red thread, for protection. Historians still argue whether these rituals were for the mother, the baby, or the spirits lurking nearby. Probably all three. Birth was dangerous for everyone. Infections were common, blood loss could be fatal, and breech births were handled with Let's say creativity and courage. But somehow, communities managed. They passed down knowledge one generation to the next. How to turn a baby with just your hands. How to ease pain with chewed licorice root or warm goose fat. How to know when it was time to call for a priest. Yes, priests were often on standby, not for medical help, but for last rites. Just in case. You shift uncomfortably on the stool, suddenly aware of how much faith people placed in those cramped little rooms, in herbs, in hope in hands that had delivered dozens of babies with no formal training, just memory and instinct. The midwife begins to hum a slow, low tune. It seems to calm everyone, even you. The woman on the bed groans, and the room tightens with her, then relaxes again. Pain relief, by the way, was minimal. Wine, maybe. A slice of bread to bite. Occasionally poppy tea, though that could be risky. Mostly women bore down and bore through it, surrounded by other women who had done the same. And when the baby finally comes squirming wet, a shock of dark hair, the room exhales. The midwife works quickly, checking the cord, clearing the mouth, wrapping the tiny body in linen. The baby cries. So does the mother. The aunt does too, quietly in the corner. You watch as the baby is anointed with a bit of oil and held up to the hearth for warmth. Someone mutters a prayer. Someone else passes a bowl of broth. It's chaotic and sacred all at once. Not long after, the midwife begins cleaning up, burning the bloody straw, folding the linens, washing her hands in a bowl of wine and vinegar. Cleanliness mattered here. Maybe not by modern standards, but by medieval ones. This is practically sterile. You ask about the placenta and are shown the garden. Yes, the garden. Many midwives buried the afterbirth in the earth, sometimes with a charm, sometimes under a tree. Fertility back to fertility. The cycle continues. The mother is fed warm milk with nutmeg, then tucked under layers of wool. She'll be churched in a few weeks, a purification ritual required before she can attend Mass again. Until then, she's expected to rest, heal, and bond. You sit by the fire now, the baby nestled nearby in a shallow wooden cradle. The flickering flames dance in the reflection of the woman's tired, joyful eyes. It's easy to forget how fragile this moment is, how many stories end differently. Still, hope is stronger here than fear. You leave the midwife's house with a new understanding. Childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't sterile or clinical, but it was deeply human. It was surrounded by love, community, old wisdom, and a stubborn will to survive. And as you make your way back through the winding village paths, stepping over puddles and chicken feathers, you hear the distant echo of a lullaby, a simple melody floating from an open window. But not all unions were so peaceful. Next, we turn to jealousy, infidelity, and the lengths people went to protect or punish those they loved, including a man who made his wife wear a goose mask for 2 weeks. Yes, really. The village green is quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you someone's about to be very publicly embarrassed. You stroll past the baker's stall. He's too focused on his loaves to look up and toward a small crowd gathering near the stocks. A curious murmur ripples through the onlookers, and then you see her. She's wearing a mask, not a delicate masquerade mask, or anything remotely elegant. No, this one is shaped like a goose's head, painted crudely complete with a long beak and exaggerated eyes. And she is not wearing it by choice. Jealousy in the Middle Ages wasn't just a private emotion, it could be a public spectacle. Today, You're witnessing the fallout of a suspected affair and the creative punishment that followed. The husband, red-faced and puffy, stands nearby with his arms crossed. He mutters something about betrayal dignity and possibly ducks. The villagers try not to laugh, but fail. It's hard to take anything seriously when someone is honking through a beak. This is what happened when infidelity, real or imagined, entered the picture. Honor was everything, especially for men. A wife's reputation reflected on her husband's social standing, so any whisper of cheating could ignite fury, fear, and in this case, feathers. Historians still argue how widespread such punishments were. Public humiliation, dunking stools, scolds, bridles. Parade masks was a common penalty for many social infractions. And while adultery might be handled privately in noble circles among peasants, it often played out with the whole village watching. And let's be clear, infidelity wasn't just a woman's crime. Men were often unfaithful, particularly those in power. But social punishments fell disproportionately on women. A cheating lord might get a talking to from his priest, a cheating miller's wife. She might end up scrubbing the town steps in her undergarments, but not all affairs were scandalous. Some were quiet, bittersweet, and surprisingly tender. You pass an elderly man carving a pattern into a walking stick. He tells you, without looking up, that he once loved the blacksmith's wife. Never told her, he says. Just helped her carry water. Sometimes the pain of secrecy lingered longer than the act of betrayal itself. In court records, you find curious little stories. A man who moved into his lover's hayloft and stayed for 7 years before anyone noticed. A woman who convinced her neighbors she was married, when in fact her husband was a traveling monk who only visited in spring. Then there were the formal accusations. A wronged spouse might bring their complaint before the manorial court, or, if wealthy enough, the ecclesiastical court. Trials could be dramatic witnesses summoned bed linens, examined love letters read aloud. In one famous case, a woman was forced to swear on a saint's relic that she hadn't so much as looked at another man. She blinked. The crowd gasped. You sit now on a bench as the goose-masked woman is finally allowed to remove her costume. Her hair is tangled, her expression unreadable. Someone offers her a piece of bread. She takes it silently. Infidelity, like everything else in the Middle Ages, was tangled up in gender power and survival. A noblewoman might be imprisoned in her own tower for suspicion alone. A servant girl might be dismissed, or worse, for catching the eye of her employer. A man could face exile, fines, or duels, and yet it happened. Love and lust rarely followed rules. People cheated, people forgave, or didn't. The stories vary. Some villages had a cucking stool, a sort of wooden dunking chair used primarily for punishing scolds and adulterers. You pass by one now half rotted in the weeds near a pond. Imagine being strapped to it, jeered at, and plunged into cold water while the townsfolk laughed, but not everyone laughed. In some cases, communities were surprisingly understanding. A failed marriage might quietly dissolve. A discreet arrangement might form. People found ways to move forward. Even the church, ever the moral compass, sometimes advised compassion. Let he who is without sin, and all that. Though the local priest who preached that also had a suspicious fondness for the baker's niece. You walk on as the sun lowers and the air turns golden. You pass a cottage where a couple argues quietly over supper. Their voices are tired, not angry. You get the sense they've argued before, and that they'll share bread again tomorrow. Jealousy didn't belong only to lovers. It crept into friendships, siblings, even among children, arguing over who got the bigger apple. The medieval world, like ours, was full of human hearts trying to protect what mattered, and sometimes it got messy, but sometimes it mended. Now, as twilight sets in, you're drawn toward the looming abbey at the edge of the village. Stone towers, quiet gardens, and strict vows of chastity, or so they say. Because next you'll peek behind the walls of holy life and discover that even monks and nuns had secrets, and some of them involved moonlit rendezvous and poetry scribbled on parchment margins. You approach the abbey under the hush of early evening, when the sky melts into violet and the bell tolls vespers. The great stone walls rise before you, cold, silent, sanctified. But as you slip inside through a side gate, you can't help but feel you're entering not just a house of God, but a house of secrets. Because while monks and nuns took vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience, history tells us quietly, bashfully, like a monk, hiding a love letter that sometimes they didn't stick to the script. The cloisters are peaceful. Lavender bushes sway in the breeze. You hear the soft shuffle of sandals on flagstone. A monk passes you, eyes, lowered lips, moving in prayer. He looks the part. But tucked into his robes is a folded piece of parchment. You're not sure, but you think you see a heart drawn in the corner. Let's be clear, not all monks and nuns broke their vows. Many lived lives of genuine devotion, often marked by grueling work, endless prayer, and impressive calligraphy. But human nature has always been a little more flexible than theology allows. Historians still argue how common secret romances in religious orders actually were. Some say they were rare. Others suggest they were simply hidden well. But records exist, accusations, penances, even poetry, hinting at relationships that bloomed in gardens, in libraries, and behind heavy oak doors. You walk through a scriptorium now, rows of desks lined with manuscripts. A scribe dips his quill in ink, copying a psalm with elegant strokes. But in the margins, another hand has scribbled a verse. My heart, cloaked in silence, beats for one unseen. Scandalous, perhaps, but also deeply human. Monasteries and convents were often isolated, which ironically made them ideal spaces for hidden intimacy. A look across the dining hall, a shared task in the herb garden, late-night prayers that turned into quiet conversations. It was a cloistered world, yes, but feelings found their way through even the thickest walls. You step into the convent, next guided by a sister who offers you bread and a warm smile. The chapel is dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of beeswax and old books. Nuns here rise at dawn, sing the hours, tend the sick, and copy texts with aching hands. Their lives are structured, disciplined, and on paper, chaste, but the letters tell a different story. In one collection, a nun writes to a fellow sister, "I have seen your soul in dreams. It walks beside mine barefoot in the snow, and still I feel no cold." The church didn't know what to make of such relationships. Were they spiritual, emotional, or something else entirely? Some love was quiet, mutual, and unnoticed. Others, less so. There's a 14th century record of a nun sneaking out of her convent to meet a local knight. She used a ladder made of knotted bed sheets and apparently remarkable upper body strength. When caught, she claimed the Virgin Mary told her it was okay. Points for creativity. Mail orders had their own secrets. Some monks fathered children, often quietly supported by the abbey. Others maintained long-distance romances through coded letters. A few even ran brothels on the side as financial ventures. You pass one monk in the cloister garden, now watering sage with remarkable focus. He may, or may not be the one writing Song of the Lilies, a local poem suspiciously passionate for someone supposedly married to the church. Still, these weren't all wild flings. Many involved real emotion, even love. The tension between desire and devotion was constant and sometimes unbearable. A monk might spend hours flagellating himself in the morning, only to spend the afternoon composing love poems in Latin. Contradiction was kind of the point. The church did try to enforce its rules. Monks and nuns caught in scandal-faced harsh penalties, relocation public penance, or being locked in solitary cells. But enforcement was patchy, and some communities turned a blind eye so long as the laundry was folded and the prayers were sung. You walk now beneath an arched ceiling, where stars are painted onto the plaster. A young novice is lighting candles. He hums softly, unaware of your gaze. You wonder what he's thinking. A hymn, a confession, or someone he's not supposed to miss. The rules of the church were rigid, but human emotion didn't always follow rules. The monasteries became places where love either withered or blossomed in secret. Sometimes both. You sit on a stone bench in the garden night falling around you. Crickets chirp. A breeze lifts your hair. And you hear it, the low, overlapping voices of evening prayer rising from the chapel. But beneath the chanting, there's something else. A heartbeat. A whisper. A longing never quite spoken. Not all love stories needed candles and rose petals. Some unfolded in the quiet turning of pages, in the careful way someone folded another's robe, or how two hands touched briefly as they passed the communion bread. Next, we step further into the shadows to the lives of those who didn't fit the mold at all. Hidden histories of same-sex love, quiet rebellions, and identities that existed outside the pages of medieval doctrine. Because even in the Middle Ages, queerness was their subtle, brave, and deeply human. It's long past sunset now. The village has gone still, just the hush of wind, the creak of distant shutters, and the soft hush of night animals waking up. You follow a worn stone path out toward the edge of town, where the trees lean in close, and the stars finally peek through the clouds. There beneath the branches are stories rarely told of love that didn't fit the mold. Tonight, we're gently stepping into the quiet, often hidden world of queer lives in the Middle Ages. These stories weren't shouted from rooftops. They're found in footnotes, in legal records, in the margins of manuscripts, where two initials are scrawled together without explanation. And yet they're there. You just have to read between the lines. You pause beside a stone wall, tracing your fingers over two carved letters, M+T. Faded, weathered, but unmistakably deliberate. A mark of something that mattered to someone sometime. A friendship, a forbidden love. Historians still argue. Medieval society, especially in Christian Europe, had rigid ideas about how people were supposed to love. Marriage was between man and woman. Anything else, sinful, unnatural, or simply ignored. And yet, among the rules, the rituals, the sermons, people still found ways to be themselves. Or as much as they could be. In the 14th century, a court record from France mentions two women living together as spiritual companions. Their neighbors whispered, of course. But nothing was proven, and the church had bigger fish to fry that week. So they were left alone, continuing their quiet shared life with dignity. And we imagine with joy Elsewhere in German-speaking regions, we find the case of a monk punished for unlawful affection toward another brother. The record doesn't say what they did. It only says that he could not stop looking at him as though he were the angel Gabriel. You smile a little. That sounds more like poetry than sin. Not all stories are gentle. Punishments for same-sex relationships could be severe, flogging, exile, even execution. But more often, they were met with silence. The subject was taboo, and the silence was in some strange way protective. If you didn't name it, you didn't have to condemn it. You wander now through the garden behind the convent. The air is thick with rosemary and dusk. A nun kneels by the fountain. Her hands clasp her eyes, not on the sky, but on another woman nearby, reading by candlelight. You can't hear what passes between them. You don't need to. Medieval literature holds curious clues, too. There are tales of knights falling deeply in love with their squires like Sir Launcelot and Galahad, whose bond is so intense that some scholars argue it eclipses Launcelot's love for Guinevere. In some versions, Galahad dies of heartbreak. Tragic, tender, possibly true. And then there are the saints. Oh, the saints. Take Saint Sergius and Saint Bacchus Roman soldiers, martyred for their Christian faith, and often depicted holding hands, faces tilted tenderly toward one another. Early Christian texts referred to them as Aristai, a Greek word implying deep romantic love. Whether or not it was physical, their bond has become a symbol of spiritual and possibly romantic partnership. You stop beneath a willow tree, now watching the branches sway. In Byzantium, in Moorish Spain, in Tang Dynasty, China's same-sex love had different names, different understandings. In some places, it was woven into poetry, philosophy, even casual jokes. In others, it was erased, feared, or hidden. Some individuals lived in gender roles different from those assigned at birth. A few records mention women dressing as men, serving in the military, entering monasteries. One story tells of a nun who lived for decades as a monk before being discovered at death. The response? A mixture of awe, confusion, and silence. The truth is, medieval queerness didn't look like modern labels. It was messy, inconsistent, deeply personal, and yet undeniably there. A man writing love poetry to another. A woman sharing a bed with her sister in Christ. A carved heart with two male names inside it. As you continue along the moonlit trail, you begin to hear a soft melody, two voices singing a lullaby in harmony. It comes from a small cottage, its window glowing warm. Inside, two older women move in sync, setting a teapot, folding cloth, lighting a lamp. There are no children, no husbands, just the rhythm of a life built together. They don't need to explain anything to you. Their story lives in the way they pass the bread, the way they smile without words. You step back into the cool air, heart oddly full. These stories weren't always preserved in books, but they lived in gestures, glances, secret tokens tucked under pillows. And even now, they linger in stone carvings, in smudged ink, in the silence between prayers. Next, we return to the world of cures and curiosities because medieval folks had thoughts about how to fix your urges. Spoiler, their solutions were weirder than the problem. From roasted lettuce to boiled owl hearts. Prepare yourself for one last strange stroll through the medical myths of medieval desire. The sky is velvet black, now freckled with stars. You wander back through the winding lanes of the village past flickering torchlight and quiet hearths, and toward a low building with smoke curling from its crooked chimney. A wooden sign hangs overhead, marked with a pestle and a bundle of herbs. The town healer lives here, and tonight you're going to learn just how strange medieval medical advice could get. Because when it came to managing one's urges, those unruly desires, those unholy appetites, medieval medicine had opinions, lots of them, and very few made any actual sense. You duck inside, and immediately your nose is ambushed. The air is thick with dried roots, vinegar, garlic, and something burnt that smells suspiciously like despair. The healer, a stooped woman with wild gray hair and a glint of mischief in her eye, motions for you to sit. She offers you a cup of something bitter and steaming. You don't ask what's in it. You sip politely. Your tongue regrets this decision. Boiled lettuce, she says with a wink, cools the blood, tames the passions, and there you have it. In medieval Europe, sexual desire wasn't just an emotion, it was a medical condition. Too much heat in the body meant too much lust. The solution: cool it down. Literally. Historians still debate how much people believe these cures. Some were based on ancient texts like those of Galen and Hippocrates, which framed the human body as a balance of four humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Lust, a symptom of overheated blood and an excess of animal spirits. So if you found yourself feeling too interested in your neighbor's stable boy, a physician might prescribe boiled lettuce to calm your body, roasted owl heart, yes really, ground pearl in wine if you could afford it, licorice root chewed before bed, still oddly common, sleeping on a hardboard because comfort clearly leads to corruption. You glance around the healer's shelves. There are jars labeled in Latin bundles of dried nettle, a suspiciously toothy root, and a sack of stones labeled testicular coolants. You decide not to ask. Even the church got in on the action. Monks and priests advised cold baths, celibate role models, and lots of fasting. Hunger Purifies One Old Monk's text reads, "A full belly breeds temptation." You imagine trying to resist temptation while hangry and damp from a frigid river bath. Not all remedies were so grim. Some believed that certain foods sparked desire. Onions leeks ginger, while others suppressed it. Pious individuals might avoid spiced wine or garlic during Lent. One chronicler warned that cheese caused dreams unfit for virgins. Make of that what you will. And then there were the really odd cures. One medieval French physician recommended binding a dried toad under the armpit to draw away lustful thoughts. Another suggested placing cold iron coins under the tongue. And let's not forget the barefoot pilgrimage, because apparently blisters beat blushing. You smile, imagining someone halfway up a muddy hill, thinking, this must be working. I no longer feel anything at all. Of course not everyone was trying to stop desire. Some healers claimed to increase it, selling aphrodisiacs made from powdered antlers, dried bees, or fish eyes soaked in vinegar. Did they work? Doubtful. But medieval lovers were nothing if not hopeful. You lean back in the chair as the healer starts crushing something in a mortar. She mutters about a lord who once asked for a potion to make his wife more receptive. She gave him a sleep draft instead and told his wife to lock the door. Stories like that weren't rare. Folk healers, many of them, women walked a fine line between medicine and magic. Their remedies were part science, part ritual, part social counseling. Sometimes their patients sought healing. Sometimes just permission. You take another cautious sip of your lettuce tea. It's still terrible, but oddly soothing. The fire crackles nearby, and for a moment, The whole room feels wrapped in the scent of time and smoke. Then the healer leans in. "Want to know the most powerful cure for lust?" she asks, eyes twinkling. You nod. "Hard work, dirty laundry, screaming children, cold feet in winter. That's what really keeps people in line." You laugh softly, and she does too. Because even in a world of owl hearts and blessed nettle baths, some truths are eternal. You step outside again, the night cooler. Now the stars brighter. Somewhere nearby, a couple argues over a blanket. Someone sneezes in the dark, and the healer returns to her mortar, grinding away at the next miracle cure for a very human condition. Desire, in the end, was treated like an illness, but it was really just another part of being alive. Sometimes inconvenient, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes poetic, and very often misunderstood. Now, we take our final walk, not towards scandal or superstition, but to the end of the day, into the inn, into bed, and into the dreams of the medieval world, where all of these strange, soft, awkward lives curled up together under patchy blankets and hoped for a quiet night. The road back to the inn is quiet now. So quiet that your footsteps on the packed dirt seem almost too loud, like you're intruding on someone else's dream. A breeze shuffles through the hedgerows, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and bread, long gone cold. You push open the crooked inn door and step inside. The embers in the hearth have mellowed to a faint orange glow, casting soft shadows across the floorboards. A dog lifts its head from under a bench, decides you're not interesting enough to bark at, and goes back to sleep. Upstairs, your room is just as you left it. Straw mattress, wool blanket, wooden bed frame that creaks if you so much as think about turning over. But somehow it's inviting, like it's been waiting all night for you to return. You slip under the covers, sighing softly as you settle into the straw, which pokes you affectionately in 4 new places. Someone in the next room coughs. Someone else mumbles in their sleep. And from downstairs comes the rhythmic clunk of someone washing mugs, slow, sleepy familiar. You close your eyes and let the weight of the day wash over you. You've wandered through weddings and whispered affairs, through courtly poems and garlic potions, through quiet convents and not-so-quiet taverns. You've listened to the rules the church insisted upon and the rules people actually followed. And somehow, through all of it, you've come to understand that love, desire, and intimacy in the Middle Ages weren't so different from today. They were awkward, messy, tender, hidden, sometimes deeply funny. You think of the goose mask again and can't help but smile. Maybe the medieval world didn't have privacy or scented bubble baths or Tinder profiles carefully curated to hide the fact that you sleep in cartoon pajamas. But it had hearts. Beating, breaking, longing hearts. People navigating desire while dodging chicken sin charts and the occasional owl-based remedy. And as you lie there, half draped in wool, half draped in history, it becomes easy to see the shape of things. The man too shy to speak. The woman too bold for her time. The couple who held hands under the table and risked being noticed. They were real, just like you. The floorboards pop softly as the building settles. A soft gust presses against the shuttered window. The candle flickers once, then dies. And so the village sleeps. Wind down 300 words. Let your body begin to slow now. Let the images fade gently like a story told beside the fire, its edges soft with time and distance. The medieval world, with all its peculiar customs and whispered secrets, quiets behind you. The church bells are silent now. The hearth embers low. The streets empty and dusted in moonlight. The lovers behind heavy curtains have long since stopped talking. The monks, the midwives, the mischievous poets, with owl hearts in their satchels, they've all drifted off. Even the dog beneath the stairs has surrendered to sleep, his paws twitching faintly in dreams. You breathe in. Slow. Easy. Let the rhythm of that old world match your breath. Maybe you feel the gentle scratch of straw against your skin, the weight of a wool blanket. Maybe you hear a lute in the distance off-key, but oddly soothing, or the muffled laughter of someone slipping home, too late their boots in their hands. Wherever your thoughts wander, let them. No need to hold on. No need to understand every detail. History, after all, is more than facts, it's feeling. And tonight, it's the comfort of knowing that people have always loved, clumsily hoped quietly, and whispered sweet nothings in languages now lost. You've traveled far, and now you can rest. So close your eyes. Let the sounds dim, the breath deepen, the thoughts blur, like ink in rain. You're safe. You're home. Good night time, traveler.